Elves, quick to anger, impulsive, and hard to understand, as described by most humans. Prosecuted and hunted, driven into the forests, they skulk in the trees, waiting, bows in hand, for a Dwan, a human, to enter their domain. But it wasn't always like this. In fact, the elves we commonly find in the Witcher world are only one offshoot of the Enundod, the most ancient of elves. After disaster struck their world, they left to find a new home, and in doing so, they eventually split into two groups. The NL, which literally means Alderfolk, or people of the Alders, and the N-Shea we all know and love. The Enundod spoke in what is called the Lathan Undod, the One Speech. After the elves decided to live different lives, their language started changing, though not by an awful lot. Their accents still made it difficult for Ciri to understand the NL elves while she was in their world, even though she could fluently speak the Elder speech at that point, the language we know from the N-Shea world. But before we talk about the N-Shea, let's first discuss the NL, as they are now much closer to the true elf than their N-Shea cousins. Although quite frankly, they don't have too many differences, save for their language, which is called Elilon. They're also taller than the N-Shea, and they seem to be slightly broader in build. After leaving their original homeworld, the N-Shea and NL actually lived together in the quote-unquote human world for a time, until the NL had had enough of their human hosts and left to find a new universe to live in. It's important to know that this constant world hopping, before coming to the human world, happened before the conjunction of the spheres. During this time, it was very easy to move freely from one world to another, with some talent and practice, that is. When the conjunction happened, while the number of worlds available increased, the doors to each world closed. Traveling between worlds suddenly became near impossible. It was likely at this point that the NL elves started cultivating the Elder Blood gene that would eventually end with Lara Doran, until it was passed on to Ciri. They wanted the ability to travel between worlds back. They wanted to open the doors. As it stands currently, they can only move around a limited amount, as seen when Eredin takes his Deag Ruadri, his red horseman, onto a wild hunt across the skies of the human world. It seems, however, that they can only physically enter another world during a time of high magical potency, like the equinox. During this time, they scour human villages in search of children to steal away to their own world, to work as slaves. Coincidentally, it's likely that the Deag Ruadri are based on the Irish Fea Dearg, meaning red man. This Fea Dearg is classified as a solitary fairy and is said to wear a red coat and cap. Solitary fairies are generally described as sluttish, slouching, jeering, mischievous phantoms. Particularly, they busy themselves with practical joking of the gruesome kind, and they're also often connected to nightmares. Sounds very Eredin to me. The Deag Ruadri's reputation is no doubt fueled in large part through the armor they wear. Their skull mask and bone-like plates make for a wonderful myth. They are described by most as taking the shape of ghosts, with flaming eyes riding on the backs of skeletal horses, tattered clothes waving around them like banners. You might wonder why an elf would ever want to dress like that, a walking, talking skeleton, that is. Their voices even change when they put on their helmets or face masks. After all, in the NL world, they don't wear anything of the sort. In their world, they are described to have cloaks billowing from their shoulders, in vibrant red, cinnamon, and amaranth colors, reminiscent of the reflection of fire in the evening sky. They wore red jackets under their armor, which was made of incredibly small steel rings that clung to their body like wool knitwear. Although Eredin's horse still looked like a dragon most times. My personal theory is simple. Humans are susceptible to fear. At this point, most humans are convinced that the Wild Hunt is a supernatural phenomenon. When people see the Wild Hunt, they don't just think, "Oh no, elves!" They think, "Oh no, ghosts!" and they run for their lives. Elves they can fight, wraiths not so much. The Nilfgaardian knights escorting Yennefer also don't bother to stand and fight at any point. There is only fear. That's what the Hunt's armor is about, fear, a very powerful deterrent. Not to mention that it seems that the Wild Hunt can summon specters into the human world to scare people, or perhaps to scout for them as well. if they don't want or can't venture through the portal themselves. Fear is one of their greatest weapons. They won't need this armor in their own world because they don't fight humans, at least not anymore. They're fighting unicorns, very powerful unicorns. And these creatures are very interesting indeed. As we know, the elves used to be able to travel wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. They weren't all too happy to give up that kind of freedom. It meant they were stuck. However, they were stuck in a realm alongside the unicorns. Unicorns that, they learned, had the power to travel between time and space. Naturally, they then used that power to open the Ardgaith, the Great Gate, through which anyone can pass to another world. And they started conquering other worlds as they did before, until they landed in their current world, which was originally a human world. They slaughtered every human there, save for some they used as slaves. But it seems that at that point, the unicorns had had enough, and they escaped. Because in this world they remain to this day. The Ardgaith remained shut, and the elves and the unicorns were now sworn enemies. The elves would have to rely on their gene research to create an elf powerful enough to open the gate on their own. The Elder Blood gene. Lara Doran ep Shedal's blood. It had immense power, and according to Avalach, it only became more powerful after all this time, when it manifested in Ciri. But how does one cultivate the power to control time and space? Well, I have a few theories. Actually, more of an amalgamation of theories. First of all, the Ensevern, the knowing ones, only exist among elves. Humans don't possess the prophetic powers that they seem to wield. They are exceptional beings just for this reason, of course, but their mastery over magic seems to reach further than they let on. When Avalach attempts to convince Ciri to stay in the NL world and get used to the idea of sleeping with their king, he seems to imply that it doesn't matter how long she stays, first by telling her that time works differently in their world, and then by telling her that they can transport her back in time. So it would be like no time had passed at all. Controlling time, you might say. A while later, when the unicorns attack, Avalach, in an attempt to escape, tells Ciri to make ready because they have to jump. The same term Eredin uses to describe Ciri's powers later. Avalach even explains later that the Knowing Ones do indeed have Ciri's abilities, but they're much less powerful. From Ciri we learn that Avalach has spent at least 400 years learning how to cross between worlds, but he can still only find and pass through pre-existing portals. Lara Doran was a Knowing One, so was Avalach, with whom she was supposed to produce this wonder child. Presumably, Oberon, their king, was an Ensevern as well, if we're going by this theory at least. That's never stated in the books though in any way, so let's just assume for now. It goes to follow that the NL were simply matching powerful elven sages that showed great skill in terms of the world-traveling powers. However, if it was that simple, I feel that an Elder Blood gene might have cultivated a long time before. I personally believe that Avalach may have experimented with the unicorn's DNA as well. After all, these powerful beings are already capable of jumping between time and space at will, and they were readily available. Why not use their genes to strengthen the elves? Iorveth does say the unicorns were used and abused. I wouldn't put it past Avalach. Oberon even threatens Ciri with Avalach's laboratory when she doesn't want to cooperate any longer. As we know, Avalach goes to great lengths for the good of the elves. When Geralt first met the elf, whose real name is Cravan Espain ap Kauman Mach, he was busying himself with painting on a rock wall. The painting depicted a striped purple buffalo and several stick figures. In drawing this painting on this particular wall, Avalach hoped that humans wouldn't destroy it, because behind this wall rested an elven graveyard. Coincidentally, Geralt advised him to draw the human stick figures with enormous erect penises, which Avalach thought was a very good idea because it could help forge the theory that the human race suffers from physical degeneration, considering their ancestors had phalluses the size of batons, and the descendants had no more than ridiculous twigs. Good job, Geralt. The graveyard, now protected by baton-sized phalluses, was called Tierna Bea Irene. It included a grave statue for Lara Doran, though there was no body, of course. Because although it isn't ever brought up too specifically, after all elves look alike to humans, the NL lived alongside the Enshe for a time to begin with, of course. Which brings us to a few interesting conclusions. To start at the beginning, the Elves, the Enundod still at this point, arrived in the Enshe's world a good 1,000 years before the humans on their white ships. They did not find the land empty, however. It was inhabited by dwarves and gnomes, and no doubt several other species still. But for completion's sake, the gnomes were there first. And this may sound surprising, but the elves did not get along with their new neighbors at all. A war broke out almost immediately. Elven arrows were aimed at dwarves during these days. However, we can assume that they found common ground eventually, as we know of at least one road that was built by elves and dwarves jointly. And so life, as far as we know, continued harmoniously for a time, until the humans landed in this world as well, after the conjunction of spheres. Now, this didn't cause trouble immediately. You must know that sorcerers and sorceresses generally side with non-humans on many issues and speak out against their persecution. This may have something to do with the first magic users being taught by elves, because humans, as you may know, did not have magical abilities until after the conjunction of spheres. So, shortly after they arrived in this world, Geoffrey Monk, one of the first mages, set off to Loch Muin, still a beautiful elven city at the time. Monk hoped to convince the elven mages there to school a group of magically active children, sources. The elves, seeing no danger in doing so, helped them, only to be massacred to the last in their sleep by Marshal Raupenek a few years later. This event, the slaughter of Loch Muin, is what started the war between elves and humans that ended with the slaughter of Sharoed. No wizards took part in this war, of course. At this point, the cultivation of the Elder Blood gene must have already started, because not long after, Lara Doran's story began. As is well known, Lara Doran, who carried the Hen Iker, the Elder Blood gene, was to mate, for lack of a better word, with Avalach. That never happened, as instead she fell in love with a human mage, Cregennan of Lod. At first, both races were happy that the two fell in love, but then others spoke out against the connection between human and elven magic. Some even considered it treason. This wasn't the only problem at the time, of course, but most were secretive and lost in translation. Personal feuds, jealousy, and envy. As a result of intrigue, Cregennan of Lod was killed, not by elves, but by humans. However, this would be the first, but certainly not the last of many times, where elves were made the scapegoat. The humans accused the elves of the murder, and so Lara Doran was hunted and persecuted. She eventually died of exhaustion somewhere in the wilderness alone, while birthing a daughter who would then be taken in by Sero, Queen of Redania. And so the second conflict between elves and humans started. At this point, the elves had lost their Elder Blood gene. And it is at this point that I believe the NL desperately sought for a way to leave this world. And I believe they found it in Tor Sirel, the Tower of the Swallow. This tower holds portals to many different worlds, including that of the NL. It was no doubt built before the humans ever landed in this world, perhaps to travel between worlds more easily. And this is where the elves would have made their choice. Legends of unicorns exist in the human world, so the elves no doubt found the unicorns in this world, then forced them to use their powers to open a portal at Tor Sirel. Even so, the magic of the tower was waning. It was now or never. The NL were to take the unicorns with them when they left. So many elves departed for the NL world, but others yet chose to stay, thinking the humans would eventually leave or perhaps all die. Needless to say, that didn't happen. This mass migration of half the elven race to another world led to some tragic goodbyes, of course, like the story of Gilban and Dillion of the White Fleet. Gilban left for the NL world, while Dillion stayed behind. Gilban, who loved Dillion dearly, hoped she would one day reciprocate his feelings and call out for him using a stone he gifted her. But she never did, and he died of sorrow. But separation wasn't the only problem the Enshe elves faced. It seems that elven magic was dwindling. From an elf lamenting over their lost magical skill, we learn this. We could do many things once. We could create illusions of magical isles, show to thousands of people dragons dancing in the sky. We could bring forth illusions of numerous armies approaching town walls, and every citizen saw that army in the same way to the very minor details of equipment and the signs on the banners. But only those incomparable ancient vixens who paid for their magical powers with their lives can do this. Since those times, abilities of our kind severely degraded, most likely as a result of living among humans. For completion's sake, vixens are fox demons that were once elves. In exchange for keeping their magical aptitude, they gave up their elven lives and became, well, fox demons. Now they steal elven children to turn into vixens as well. The humans only gained magical abilities when they were thrown into a world alongside the elves. Is it possible that the elven magic is siphoned into humans, and that is why their magic is diminishing? We can see this clear loss of magic in the amount of elven sages as well. In a report found in the NL world, there is mention of sending the elven sages to deal with it. Avalach is a sage. Presumably Oberon is one, Lara was one. There are a lot of sages to go around in the NL world. We know of exactly one elven sage in the world of the Enshe, Ida Emion. Just one. It seems that all the Enshe will have left eventually is their arrogance. Unlike the Enshe, the NL are still justifiably arrogant. The Witcher 3 showed us a glimpse of the NL world, and it looked charming, of course. But they didn't show us the grand palace of Tirnalia, which is described as if made of white lace, so delicate and light it seemed ethereal, as if they were not buildings, but the ghosts of buildings. The Enshe used to have palaces such as these as well, of course, but unfortunately they were all destroyed during the war with the humans. Not all by humans, mind you, but by elves. During the first all-out human-elven war, elves did not want to destroy their cities and palaces, but instead simply retreated, hoping to retake their homes eventually. However, instead, the humans built upon the elven cities, making them their own. Cities like Vengerberg, Lyria, Vizima, Maribor and Beauclair were all old elven cities. One of the Enshe's most beautiful palaces, Shadowed, was also destroyed in this manner. Elves, you must know, do not build castles. They do not build walls around their cities. They treasure beauty, detail. And a wall naturally isn't very beautiful, no matter how you look at it. The palace of Shadowed was destroyed by the elves before they left, but elves still visit the palace grounds whenever they can, to look upon the statue of Eliden, where the beautiful white-lilied flowers bloomed, roses of Shadowed. They still cultivate those roses even now. They mustn't ever die. To understand why this particular palace is so important to the Enshe, so important in fact, that even Avalach falls silent when it is mentioned, you must first know about Eliden. Eliden, known as Elidena by dwarves and humans, led the elves into battle roughly 200 years before the Second Northern War. The elven elders were fiercely opposed because they knew the battle was lost before it even began. They knew that the elves would be shattered after this defeat, that they would not be able to recover from it. The elders wanted their people to survive, so they destroyed their towns and retreated into the inaccessible wild mountains to wait. By human standards, elves are near immortal in terms of time. They'd hoped humans would simply pass, like a drought or a heavy winter. However, Eliden would not wait, and steered up the young instead. So they took up arms and followed her into their last, desperate battle, and they were massacred. Mercilessly massacred. They died not to win the war, but for a symbol, for Shadowed, their treasured city. They died with dignity, heroically and honorably. But though they may have saved their honor, they brought nothing but ruin to their people, condemning them to annihilation. The Enshe, once proud elves, now bitter and spiteful, their grand cities all but destroyed. Even though they've been driven back into the forests, and beyond the mountains, they retain their sense of elven pride, alongside their loathing for the Dwan, of course. After the NL had left their world, the Enshe were left to their own devices. Humans encroached ever further onto their domain. More and more cities were destroyed, until not much else was left to the elves but the wilderness. But land isn't all that humans took. The elves, the ones that believed in coexisting with humans, had made a great many discoveries in their long lives. Not only their art, but also their science. Humans won't be prepared to admit it, but most of their civilization is built on elven discoveries, as well as magical research. And magic, of course, was initially taught to humans by the elves. Things like makeup, the first written language, runes, or screw pumps were invented by elves. And according to Triss, humans have given bloody little back in return. Another invention attributed to elves are aqueducts. However, they were actually invented by the Vran, another race that was already around when the elves landed in this world. The Vran, as far as we know, lived mostly near Loch Muin. In fact, the Vran built the city to begin with. You can tell quite easily, even outside of Iorveth telling you, as inside of the Loch Muin sewers, you find a Vran sentry that, when given the correct password, opens a portal to another, closed-off room that looks a great deal like the chambers you find in Loch Muin. Inside this room is another puzzle you must solve to open the door to the next room. So these creatures were certainly very intelligent. So, wait, what happened to the Vran? These creatures are literally everywhere, not just Loch Muin. We find a Vran sarcophagus in the swamp near Vizima. Another elven city? That's a bit too much of a coincidence. Now, this will be some wild speculation again, of course, but the Vran were clearly a very advanced race, building cities, aqueducts. The Sephiroth we find in the sarcophagus indicates they also had an active faith. The Sephiroth is also used to open a magical tower in the same swamp, so it has some magical potency as well. Not only that, but we find a circle of elements right next to it, a magically active obelisk that empowers Witcher magic. So, complicated cities, a sprawling civilization, magic? That all sounds oddly familiar. The humans built on elven works quite a bit, but did the elves do the same with the Vrans? This might seem like flimsy evidence, but there is more, and this is what made me really stop to think on this theory. In the sewers of Loch Muin, behind the Vran sentry, behind the puzzle in that room, we find the Operator. He introduces himself by telling us that the ancients vested his soul with the task of operating their most prized artifacts. The ancients, of course, being the Vran. This artifact allows you to rectify certain errors of the past. Sounds a lot like time manipulation. Not only that, but in the Witcher battle arena, he has abilities like Time Breach, Collapsing Planes, and When Worlds Collide, which sounds a lot like a conjunction. Now, that might be off-canon, but the artifact isn't. After you use the artifact, or when you kill the Operator, he also opens a portal to leave again. But the portals he opens during the fight are more interesting. While you fight the Operator, he summons gargoyles. Clearly there are no gargoyles around in this closed-off room, certainly not this many. So where did they come from? During another fight with another Vran guard, aptly named the Guardian, he summons wraiths. How does this work? I'm willing to bet they're portaled in. And who else do we know that portal in monsters and bid them to fight? The Wild Hunt. So, time manipulation, portals, controlling monsters. Could it be that the elves learned everything they knew about this kind of magic from the Vran? Or at the very least, the NL might have. Because there are some discrepancies to be found among the story behind the Vran's demise. Roach tells us that after the elves of Loch Muin were defeated, the humans found reptile bones in caves, showing marks of swords, insinuating that the elves might have been at war with the Vran, killing them all. However, Iorveth tells us that all the elves encountered when they came across the ancient Vran cities were ghosts and ruins. He claims that disease and climate change conquered the Vran, as Loch Muin used to be a lush green valley. As the weather turned cold, the Vran couldn't gather enough food in their mountains, and so they descended to the lowlands where they encountered the first human settlers, and their plagues. And so they began to fall ill and die. However, the truth lies somewhere in between. A man named Dirhenna reports his findings on what he encountered when he explored the ruins of Loch Muin. The Vran lived well in the mountains of Loch Muin for a long time, until the Elves arrived. Because in the ruins found beneath Loch Muin are cells filled with the bones of lizard men. It's clear that experiments were carried out here on captured Vran. There is mention of an elf named Iorveth, likely the man responsible for these experiments. And Dirhenna discovers that the elves spent their time cultivating a virus that, once infected, would lead to infertility. And this is what caused their extinction in the end. Everything else just sped things up. I don't doubt that the elves did fight the Vran. After all, they started out fighting every other race they encountered as well. And I don't doubt that human diseases were fatal to the Vran, that they ran out of food in the mountains. But they might have been able to overcome that if it weren't for their inability to reproduce. In the end, humans started fighting Vran as well, as the few Vran still left joined bandit groups out of desperation. Though even as bandits, they opposed needless suffering of their enemies. So that's strange. Why would Iorveth lie to us? Surely he would know what the elves truly did here, and he has no reason to lie to Geralt, as Geralt is already aware of the many atrocities Iorveth and his commando had committed. Well, that's quite simple, actually. The virus the elves created didn't just work on the Vran. It also worked on elves that weren't vaccinated. So plenty of elves were caught in the crossfire, becoming infertile in the process. And as elves don't reproduce easily in the first place, that was a problem. So the elves responsible went through great trouble to erase their work. The pages of Dirhenna's diary were encrypted with a spell, but once we decrypt it, we find that in the final diary entry, Dirhenna realizes that he has put himself in danger. And this is what he writes. I regret having learned of this dark episode in the city's history. I have become wary of danger, as the elves must surely be aware that someone has discovered their secret. I have made my last stroll in the ruins of the Black Academy. I will seal my laboratory and disappear. The time has finally come to seize Arcania once more. So the elves found out about his digging, and Dirhenna had to flee for his life. At this point, it's likely that only very few elves, if any at all, know what truly happened to the Vran. And as a side theory, might it be the Black Shay that initially lived in Loch Muin, considering he talks of the Black Academy? But in the end, it was the elves that brought the Vran to extinction. In the most ironic fashion as well, as the Enshay face the exact same problem, infertility. Elves, though they live a very long time, are not fertile throughout their entire lifespan. In fact, according to Avalach, and we can agree that he's an authority on the subject of mating, elves only ovulate once every 10 to 20 years. And after they reach a certain age, they are no longer able to have children at all. And this is a problem because most of the young elves fight for the Scoia'tael, or they died during Elrond's uprising. And the Scoia'tael are dying in the forests. They aren't welcome in Dol Blathanna, the Valley of the Flowers, the only free elven state. So it's no wonder that Iorveth jokingly calls Dol Blathanna the Valley of the Sterile Elders for this reason. During the events of the uprising in Edirn, Dol Blathanna had been an elven state for 5 years. Over 2,000 elves settled there, but they only produced a dozen or so children. It's no wonder that there is no elven word for overpopulation. And for this reason, Geralt decided long ago that he did not want to take part in the war against non-humans. He didn't want to kill more elven youth. Quite frankly, humans were only winning the war because they multiply like rabbits. Surprisingly, when mating with humans, elves become pregnant far more often. Avalach suspects this was because of either a hidden hormone or some kind of combination of hormones. This is why there are quite a lot of half-elves around. For a while, elves and humans mix well enough, and this is why almost everyone in the world has at least some elven blood at this point. However, eventually, as non-human hatred grew, mixed relationships were persecuted. Half-blood and even quarter-blood children were targeted by heavy discrimination, and elves were hung for sleeping with human women. So, elves are losing people to the war, to diseases, to pogroms, to fox demons, and they're barely reproducing. Because Elrond took the majority of the young elves into battle to die for their honor, even if the war on non-humans would stop right now, there's a good chance elves would still go extinct. But why? Why did this war start? Why did the Scoia'tael begin their fight for freedom? Why aren't they welcome in Dol Blathanna? After all, they need young elves to keep their people alive. Well, of course the two conflicts previous to the Northern Wars didn't help. After the massacre at Loch Muin and Lara Dorn's death, animosity reached an all-time high. So before the Second War between Nilfgaard and the North, Nilfgaard sent spies into the North to incite the Elves. Their battle cry? Humans to the sea. Nilfgaard promised the Elves freedom, their own land, no more oppression. In exchange, the Elves started a guerrilla war against the Northern Kingdoms, aiding Nilfgaard where they could. They murdered, plundered, and burned everything they could. And while some humans argued that the Scoia'tael were no worse than common bandits, it's well known that bandits wanted your coin, and not everyone had coin to steal. The Elves, however, wanted human blood, and everyone had some of that. They killed humans that never hurt a non-human in their lives. This unwarranted violence made humans wary of integrated non-humans as well, accusing them of aiding the squirrels. The appearance of Scoia'tael fueled a lot of the racism, even though the majority of non-humans condemned Scoia'tael activity and wanted nothing to do with them. They were caught between a rock and a hard place. In denouncing the Scoia'tael, they made themselves a target for elven arrows, but humans wouldn't believe them regardless, and so they killed them just the same. Scoia'tael would often come to non-human houses during the night to request aid. It's difficult to refuse when confronted with a commando of armed elves and dwarves, but they would be made outlaws for aiding the squirrels as well. So now, humans started killing women and children alike, no matter if they had lived among the humans peacefully for years. And this escalated the conflict tremendously, driving more non-humans to join the Scoia'tael to escape the pogroms. Even the dwarves attempting to help the northern realms were mistrusted. Jarpen Zigrin, the dwarf we find fighting for freedom in Vergen, worked as an escort for a northern transport when they were attacked by Scoia'tael. As it turned out, the transport was a trap to test Jarpen, as the humans didn't believe he was truly helping them. They thought he was with the Scoia'tael. Jarpen lost dwarven friends in the process, all the while slaughtering young elves, because humans would not trust any non-humans. It was no wonder that non-humans, whether they wanted to coexist or not, grew more bitter by the day. Of course, propaganda from both sides also didn't help. Elves had stories about horrible man-witches that tricked and lied those that came to them, about ugly, smelly humans that ate babies. And humans had stories about elves poisoning the wells, or coming together to discuss the downfall of humanity while drinking the blood of an innocent child. All of it was, of course, nonsense, but the hatred between the races only ever grew. And it didn't help that non-human discrimination was quite out in the open and widely accepted. In Edgin Vale, an elven-based city again, they even wrote it on the walls, "Elves to the reservations." The mayor of this town also openly hated elves, calling their blood and race accursed. According to him, everything bad was the fault of the elves. Although, ironically, humans didn't quite hate elves enough to not sleep with their women, who they considered very beautiful. I suppose in part because elves don't find humans very attractive, they very rarely rape anyone at all. Although it is implied that Vess was kept around for that reason, before Roach saved her. Humans, however, very frequently rape elven women, even when they constantly say they hate elves, Lorido being one of the prime examples. This sort of behavior and the events of the past may be why plenty of humans did work together with the Scoia'tael, as they agreed with their fight for freedom. Although many also just worked with the squirrels because they hated the people around them, and Scoia'tael arrows are great for killing obnoxious neighbors. But quite a few truly did believe non-humans deserved a better fate than this. And who would blame them really, because the peaceful non-humans bore the brunt of the hatred fueled by the Scoia'tael. Persecution of non-humans that did try to live alongside humans peacefully included, but was not limited to, robbing their shops, arson, and the occasional beating, often followed up by a bloody pogrom. The city guards, of course, never lifted a finger to stop humans from murdering elves and dwarves in the streets. Groups like the Rangers of the Forest ran rampant through the woods as well. A group of infamous volunteers all about eradicating non-humans. They often boasted about butchering elves, spriggans, and eerie wives in the most horrible of ways. Even humans that weren't all too fond of non-humans despised these rangers. During the war, non-humans also paid a much higher tax than anyone else. All new, made-up, non-human specific taxes. Non-humans were effectively funding the entire war on non-humans on their own. And because fighting elves was so different from fighting an all-out war on the battlefield, special forces were created to fight them. After all, catching an elf in the woods or a gnome or dwarf in the mountains is nigh impossible. With their far superior speed and stamina, and their silent movements, even in full armor. Special forces units were generally made up of mainly criminals, because they were actually better equipped to fight a guerrilla war. The first unit of this kind was formed by Demavend of Edirn, who had a particular hatred for elves. And this unit was led by Black Rayla, later known as White Rayla. They were as effective as they were cruel and ruthless, and they were all well known for the horrible torture tactics they used on their elven prisoners. Which is why elves generally did not let themselves be captured alive. Elves do not retreat, do not give in, until ordered to do so. They fight to the very last, even against the odds. The Scoia'tael, elves and dwarves, unhappy with the way of the world. Skulking around forest roads, they butcher any unsuspecting human that dares approach their forests. But not every disgruntled non-human wanted to join the fight alongside the Scoia'tael. Many of the dwarves from Mahakam left their work in the mines to fight the humans, and this was starting to cost Lord Hogg, the ruler of Mahakam, quite a lot of money. Due to this, he started a campaign to deter dwarves from joining the Scoia'tael, even cheering on pogroms because, as he said, dwarves that settled outside of Mahakam were renegades. From Iorveth, we hear that Roach of the Blue Stripes, Temerian's special forces, was in large part responsible for pacifying the Mahakaman foothills. So Lord Hogg didn't bother stopping punitive expeditions, sent to stop the dwarves from helping the non-human rebels, even in his own lands. And eventually those expeditions stopped and the dwarves resigned themselves to work in the mines once more. I suppose Lord Hogg wasn't afraid of the humans ever attacking Mahakam in full force. Zoltan tells us as much at least. Attacking the Dwarven Mountains was far too costly for anyone to undertake. Both the north and the south imported dwarven steel, and if they started a war, the dwarves and gnomes would simply flood the mines and leave, and everyone would be fighting with sticks. So economically, the dwarves have by far the best position among the non-humans, at least those living in Mahakam. However, even for those that left, it was easier to integrate with humans. As far as dwarves are concerned, wherever the clan lives, that's a dwarf's home. Whereas elves integrate their country and territory, not their people. The land they live on is their home, even if every elf had been banished from those lands for centuries. The best example of this is, of course, Dol Blathana, the Valley of the Flowers, named as such because the ground is incredibly fertile. Which is also why the humans decided to settle on these lands in the first place, and in doing so, they ousted the elves, drove them into the Blue Mountains. The humans decided to keep the elven name of the lands because, according to Filavandrel, humans aren't very imaginative. Filavandrel en Fidel of Silver Towers, of the Filiorn family from White Ships, was of course the leader of most of the free elves in the Valley of the Flowers before it became an elven duchy. A troublesome position as the mountains were not nearly as fertile as the valley below. Elves, you must know, never did any farming throughout their existence. They relied entirely on what the land gave them, which was enough because the elves did not require much. After all, there weren't too many to go around. Much to the dismay of the elves, the humans changed the world tremendously. Their swift rise in population, alongside their farming practices, caused that which the elves used to eat or craft with to die. And so, driven from their fertile lands, they were now starving. And they were forced to ask a Sylvan, Torque, for help. Torque stole food, seeds, and knowledge about farming for the elves from the humans. It becomes even more clear that they'd never done any farming when Geralt realized that, in the Elder speech, they do not have words for corn, beans, or oilseed. Coincidentally, at that point, Geralt proposes the elves trade with the humans in the valley. Many elven items held great value among humans. However, Filavandrel tells him that they do not wish to cohabit on the humans' terms. It would mean that they would have to acknowledge the human sovereignty. and he's afraid the elves would lose their identity. Not to mention that they would never be seen as equals by humans. They would be slaves, pariahs, or worse. It is a common belief among elves and most other non-humans that humans hate anything that differs from them. But it seemed that not all of nature agreed with the elves. The Queen of the Fields, Danameves, Lifia, Danamebi, and many other names are given to this deity of fertility. She is a golden-haired, blue-eyed beauty that floats across the land, decorated with garlands of flowers, ears of corn, and bunches of herbs. At her left-hand side, a young stag patters on stiff legs, and at her right rustles an enormous hedgehog. It is said that where she treads, the earth blossoms and creatures breed. And it is also said that one day Lifia will settle among a tribe, which above all others will rise. But that is regarded as a fairy tale. The Queen of the Fields had left the elves a long time ago. In fact, she now lived among the humans of the valley, disguised as an ordinary girl. When Lifia came to Filavandrel, he begged her to come with them, to aid them, because although he hid his despair behind a stoic mask, Filavandrel and most other elves were well aware that their race was in fact slowly going extinct. And eventually, even if they could survive on the few seeds they'd stolen from the humans, they would not last in the mountains. They would not learn to cultivate the land efficiently in time. They would fall victim to diseases they could not cure, like Toruviel, who was already sick. And it certainly didn't help that the elves of the Blue Mountains did not maintain any relationships with not only humans, but even their own blood relatives that decided to live among the humans. The average lifespan of elves, though still thrice that of humans, grew shorter each year. They needed children. They needed fertile lands. But Lifia shook her head and spoke to him telepathically. Geralt caught some of it and explained later that she spoke of hope and that all things renew themselves and won't stop doing so. Unfortunately, this renewal would have to wait, as the elves were now a part of something larger, the Northern War, and the Scoia'tael were eagerly used by Nilfgaard. First, during the Thanet coup, where they were sent in an attempt to capture Cyrilla of Sintra. Then, during the Battle of Brenna, where they were sent out to break through the enemy lines, where they attacked the field hospitals. In return for their valuable support, the elves were granted the Duchy of Dol Blathanna. They did have to liberate it themselves, of course. And when the elves eventually took back the Palace of Dol Blathanna, the human governor living there previously stole practically everything that wasn't nailed to the floor, except for the garden, which he couldn't take, so he burned it to ashes. After taking back the valley, Filavandrel suggested they start expanding their borders. But Enid and Glenna, also known as Francesca Findabair, now the Elven Queen of Dol Blathanna, thought it too soon. They only had barely enough power to defend Dol Blathanna in itself. When Filavandrel offered to call back the Scoia'tael to fight for them, as their fight had lost all meaning now that they had their own land again, Enid declined. Emhyr, the Emperor of Nilfgaard, had gifted them the Valley of the Flowers, but in return, the elves had to keep fighting the Northern War. They had to keep dying for Nilfgaard. Dol Blathanna was not even allowed to support them. They were to denounce them instead, or the Cadweni and Edirnian lords would not accept the elven state as such. Redania didn't accept them regardless. Unsurprisingly, Filavandrel was furious, and Enid and Glenna asked him for forgiveness as a tear rolled down her cheek. Filavandrel eventually said that while he could forgive her, he could not tell whether the Scoia'tael would too. This in itself was a knife in the back of the elves, but things were about to take a turn for the worst for the Scoia'tael. Before the war had started in earnest, the northern leaders had focused their attention on the Scoia'tael in Kedwen and Edirn specifically. Persecutions and pogroms were rife against all non-humans, but they had eventually divided their attention between the two fronts, Scoia'tael and Nilfgaard. Now, however, Emhyr had signed a peace treaty with Foltest of Temeria and Henselt of Kedwen. Temporary, of course, unbeknownst to the northern kings, but Emhyr would use this time to set up a new all-out offensive which would eventually end in the Battle of Brenna. During this time of precarious peace, however, The North focused their attention back on the Scoia'tael, for now their only enemy. Emhyr was using them as decoys. The Scoia'tael had tried to run for Dol Blathanna, in vain of course, and they were shot down from all sides. And non-human hatred was now at such an all-time high, the soldiers had even started attacking dryads in their forests. Dryads who used to give humans a warning shot to tell them to keep away. But no more. Humans wandering too closely to the forests of the dryads were now shot on sight, and elves took refuge with their dryad sisters. Many, like Echnes dryads, not only allowed the elves to hide among them, but they healed and fed them as well. Dryads, you see, aside from mating with humans and elves alike, preferred the elves because they respected nature the same way dryads do. And no doubt it helped that they spoke the same language, albeit with an accent, of course. Scoia'tael still continued their fight against the humans as well, of course, although their supplies were dwindling. They often attacked caravans and traders, looting them for valuables. It was easy to recognize whether a victim was attacked by Scoia'tael in those times, as the arrows would have been pulled out. A good arrow tip cost half a crown, you see, and especially as the Scoia'tael weren't able to simply walk into town to trade, every arrow counted. And the northern kingdoms did everything within their power to cut off their supply routes, if they did have outsiders helping them, in an attempt to isolate them and starve them out. To restock, the elves traded with hawkers, or in the elven language, afkarren. They were humans selling to Scoia'tael specifically. Smugglers, you might say. The plundered goods had no value to elves, so they traded them with the Hafkarren for weapons, ammo, saddles, and the like. One of their best sellers was an arrow tip that split into needles once shot into their target, so it was near impossible to treat the wound, especially since it almost always tore through the organs as well. Small wonder it was otherwise illegal. Eventually, of course, the elves were called to arms and made ready for the Battle of Brenna, which they lost. This meant that Nilfgaard would have to do quite a few concessions during the peace negotiations. One of them included the Scoia'tael. In the end, it was decided that the commanders of the Vryheid Brigade were to be sent to the northern kingdoms to await a fair trial and likely amnesty. However, as far as we know, that never happened. And while the elves didn't have high hopes for this fair trial and amnesty to begin with, this went a little further than that. Once they arrived in Dillingen on the border of the northern and Nilfgaardian realms, the commanders were brought on shore, and several elves were dragged out of the line after some civilians present pointed them out. Among them, Isengrim, Angus Bree-Cree, and Riordain. They were dragged off together, and Isengrim realized that they would not have a quick death waiting for them. Angus Bree-Cree and Riordain were apparently granted amnesty. However, the northern nobles had bought out the soldiers, and so they would be brutally murdered regardless. A noose was thrown around their necks, and they were dragged across the floor, where they were slowly stabbed to death. Isengrim was to meet an especially gruesome fate. No doubt it had something to do with honey and an anthill, but it did not come that far, because Isengrim had managed to free himself and escaped. In the end, he fled towards the Elskerdeg Pass to Zerrikania. On his way there, he met two other refugees, Sigismund Dijkstra and Boreas Mun. No one's seen Isengrim since then. He might still be in Zerrikania, or even Hakland. He might have died. It's a pity we can't ask Dijkstra about it. The other officers, we can assume, were killed and tossed into the ravine of the Hydra. I say we can assume, because people like Coniach Dareo, who was dragged off to Drakenborg, no doubt for more torture ending in an eventual hanging, wouldn't be counted among the bodies. And Iorveth, as we know, also escaped, which meant that out of the 32 commanders of the Vryheid Brigade, at maximum only 29 bodies would fill the ravine. Drakenborg, of course, was a Redanian castle converted into a concentration camp for elves and other subversive elements. The captives in the death cell, where they kept the prisoners soon to die, would often sing the Hymn of the Joyful, so named because the cell sounded far too joyful after all the watered-down alcohol they were fed. It was a song composed in Drakenborg, whose words were learned by each of the prisoners in the barracks at night, by listening to the sounds coming from the death cell, knowing that someday they would join the chorus. The hanged people dance on the ropes, rhythmically writhing in spasms. Sing your song with melancholic emotion to amuse the joyful. Each of the dead remember when their feet left the stool, and their eyes popped out of their sockets, dance on the hanging ropes, happily writhe in spasms, and the wind carries their songs, the ringing chorus all around. After the Second Northern War, the Scoia'tael, in accordance to the Peace of Sintra, were renounced by the free elves of Dol Blathanna. The squirrels were hated by all, shunned by all. Elves and dwarves were dying in the forests, fighting for freedom still. Betrayed even by Nilfgaard. Never trust a Dwan, as they say. Even though the Nilfgaardians were said to be descendants of the Black Sidhe, and so they had elven blood. Even though the Nilfgaardian language was quite close to the Henling, the elder speech variant of the Enshe. Nilfgaard so alike in terms of traditions, where just like the elves the children were taught to fight and ride a horse from birth. Nilfgaard who promoted equality between the races. Still, even they betrayed the elves. The Scoia'tael never stopped fighting. Yevin took his commando to fight in the forests near Vizima, Iorveth left for the forests in Flotsam, and eventually Vergen in an attempt to gain equal rights for non-humans in a free state led by Saskia the Dragon Slayer. Better known, of course, as the Dragon Sesynthesis. All of it seemingly in vain. Most ironically, in the end, no one would remember the elves. Throughout history, humans had been chipping away at the elven legacy. Since elves don't keep historical writings, as they don't see a need for them due to their long lives, their cities and art are far more important to them than humans realize. Their creations are, in essence, their historical records. Even other non-humans, those that had attempted to some success to live alongside humans peacefully, can see that their own culture is slowly deteriorating. Zoltan laments a dwarven and elven road being picked to pieces by humans. All the humans' big cities are built on elven and dwarven foundations. Bit by bit, non-humans are not only dying, but their history is being erased. And humans seem to replace it with their own version of reality. The pogrom in Rivia was written off as a tragic event, a spontaneous reaction, a sudden and unpredictable outburst of justified anger induced by the hostility of the dwarves and elves towards the humans of the city. They claimed it was the dwarves who attacked first, not the humans. Blatant lies, of course. They forgot to mention that this spontaneous reaction had weapon carts already present, handing out weapons to humans. Or that most of the humans fighting were people they had never seen in that town. Or that the military intervened suspiciously late and with visible distaste. Non-humans, no matter the kind, have no future in a human world. As depressing as that sounds, they're just too different. Most everything elven is turned into an insult by humans. Elves love colorful clothing, often decorated with feathers and shawls, and this was often used to insult women dressing in equally colorful clothing and wearing colorful makeup. This is likely why integrated elves generally wear a mixture of human and elven fashions. Although in the Scoia'tael's case, it's more a desperation. Even the elven food and drinks are different, and not generally liked by humans. And the Scoia'tael, although they try so very hard not to be used, are still used time and time again. The flames of the Vizima uprising were fanned by the Flaming Rose, a group of organized racists that intended to rile up the Scoia'tael enough so they would attack Vizima. And in this way, the leader of the Flaming Rose hoped to weaken the position of Foltest of Temeria so the Flaming Rose could rule in his stead. Then again, they were used by Nilfgaard unwittingly when they helped Letho of Gullet slay the northern kings to ready the north for the Nilfgaardian invasion. Elves aren't seen as people. At worst, they're seen as criminals and bandits. At best, they're seen as tools. Hen-gedimdaith, among those of the first taken to the elves to be taught the art of magic, wrote this passage in his book on elves and humans. Upriver we saw their towns, as delicate as if they were woven from the morning mist out of which they loomed. It seemed as if they would disappear a moment later, blown away on the wind which rippled the surface of the water. There were little palaces, white as nenufar flowers. There were little towers looking as though they were plated out of ivy. There were bridges as airy as weeping willows, and there were other things for which we could find no word or name. Yet we already had names for everything which our eyes beheld in this new, reborn world. Suddenly, in the far recesses of our memories, we found the words for dragons and griffins, mermaids and nymphs, sylphs and dryads once more, for the white unicorns which drank from the river at dusk, inclining their slender necks towards the water. We named everything, and everything seemed to be close to our hearts, familiar to us, ours. Apart from them, they, although so resembling us, were alien, so very alien that, for a long time, we could find no word for their strangeness. He quite literally tells us that humans find elves stranger than dragons and unicorns. And while there are many humans still that also wish to live in peace alongside the non-humans and even sympathize with their suffering, there are equally many that despise them. As Dandelion put it in his journal, "I know many non-humans, and if anything stands in the way of coexistence, it is human ignorance, spite, and ungratefulness. And unfortunately, due to their difficulty in reproducing, the non-human population is only ever going down." So, what to do? Their fight for freedom will obviously not save the Scoia'tael. They're outnumbered and outgunned. But, wait, didn't Avalach tell us that the NL wanted to open the gate between world to evacuate the races of the human world? Wouldn't that mean that alongside the NL, the Enshe would rule over mankind and all the other races again? Well, actually, it seems unlikely that the Enshe would be seen as equals by the NL, or that any of this evacuation nonsense would actually happen. There are a few hints at this throughout books and games, and the most obvious one is a report I referenced in an earlier video, found in the NL world. In it, Inglor Heljanwe, an NL viceroy, informs Gels that the White Frost is slowly gaining ground in the NL world, and that even the sages can do little to stop it. He urges Gels to swiftly evacuate the endangered NL provinces and to strengthen and radicalize the measures intended to seize Enshe territory. They're not trying to save anyone but themselves. They want to open the gate of the world to move their army into the Enshe world so they can take it for themselves. They're not going to ask the Enshe to join them in this, because if they were, they would have already done so a long time ago. As we know, the NL have contacts all over the human world. For example, the crones in Velen. They leave their realm every so often to go on a wild hunt for human slaves. But if they're capable of doing this, why wouldn't they instead use this time to take the Enshe from their world? Why don't they bring their Enshe cousins to the NL world so they might prepare for an attack together? After all, it's even easier now to do so, now that they have Caranthir on their side. Caranthir Arthaniel, who was in essence simply Avalach starting over again in cultivating the Elder Blood gene. No doubt he'd been working on that since Laradoran, fell through, shall we say. And as a side note, I theorize that Caranthir might actually be Avalach's son, because we know that he was meant to reproduce with Laradoran, so he was certainly still fertile at the time. If not in blood relations, he at least saw him as such. We know Caranthir was Avalach's pupil gone rogue. And you might remember this scene from the game. Ciri leaves to aid Geralt and Avalach stops her, informing her that to stop the White Frost aura spreading from the battlefield, she must break the staff of the mage that cast the spell in the first place. That mage, of course, was Caranthir, and Avalach knew this. Ciri responds by telling him, "I'll not stop with his staff," implying she'll kill Caranthir. After this comment, Avalach is seen to be quite deeply saddened, especially for his doing. Many have interpreted this as Avalach fearing that Ciri might die, and that this confirms that Avalach has romantic feelings for her. However, I believe that he is distraught because he knows full well that Ciri is capable of killing Caranthir, and that pains him deeply. But enough of my theorizing. Caranthir is the reason the Wild Hunt can portal around in such large numbers, even though they can't quite invade all out to fight a full-fledged human army. So it should be quite easy to evacuate the Enshe in this way, right? So why don't they? Avalach tells Ciri during her stay in the NL world that their ultimate goal is to open the Ard Gaith, the Great Gate, and of course to then evacuate the Enshe world before the White Frost happens. And while Avalach gets extremely upset when Ciri accuses him of lying, As doubting one's word is a grave insult to the NL, Eredin tells us this instead. Avalach is an Ensevern. The knowing ones have their own code of honor, which with many noble phrases conceal an old rule that the end justifies the means. Outside of how much we trust Eredin here, of course, it does make a lot of sense, and it is a very telling thing to say indeed. Avalach would have known full well that the White Frost would reach the NL world before it would the Enshe world, so evacuation? That's nonsense, plain and simple. They wish to take the Enshe world for themselves to save the NL from annihilation. As Nimue estimates, from her time on, it would take about 3,000 years for the White Frost to reach the Enshe world. Disregarding the fact that the games decided to turn this perfectly natural phenomenon into a faceless magical monster, Avalach lied to Ciri. And he does this more often, of course, as shown during the Oniromancing session where Gels was supposed to see the king's death. Avalach managed to show everyone a complete fabrication. This scene of Oberon's death never happened. He did not die alone, that is true, but Eredin was nowhere in sight. Ciri was with him in his dying moments. And it is very strange indeed that Ciri makes no mention of this after the Oniromancing session. Perhaps Avalach told her to keep quiet so they could ensure Gel's support. After Oberon's death, Ciri confronted Eredin moments later. Eredin then insisted that Oberon would be much more aroused this night. And when Ciri tells him Oberon was dead, overdosed on the stimulant Eredin gave him, Eredin looked genuinely shocked. We can only speculate on whether he was an excellent actor or if he really did not mean to kill Oberon. I am personally in the latter camp, but regardless, he wasn't there for his death. And keep in mind that all of this was Avalach's idea. The Oniromancing, asking Gels to dream with them. Remember, the end justifies the means. He lied again, this time to Gels to ensure his support. Avalach likely accused Eredin of murdering Oberon after Ciri escaped, and this was his version of events. So what does the future look like for the Enshe? Well, it's actually stated in the book. During our flash forwards, shall we say, to Nimue, also known as the Lady of the Lake, and her Oniromancer Conviramurs, this interesting bit of dialogue happens. And the portrait of Francesca Finnebear, painted by Elves hanging in the Vengerberg Gallery? Asked Conviramurs. A forgery. When the door was opened and the Elves departed, they took away with them or destroyed every work of art, leaving not a single painting. We don't know if the Daisy of the Valleys was really as comely as the tales have it. We have no idea at all what Ida Emian looked like. And since in Nilfgaard images of sorceresses were destroyed very diligently and thoroughly, we don't have any idea about the true appearance of Asirava Anahit or Fringilla Vigo. Door being translated as gate in fan translation, so it seems the elves did manage to leave this world in the end. And honestly, I have several theories on how this might have happened. I'll tell you about the two most likely ones here. Let me know which one you find most plausible, or perhaps you have a theory of your own. First, there is of course the talk of hope and rebirth from the Queen of the Fields. Then there is the prophecy of Ithlin, which again speaks of rebirth after the White Frost. And the belief among the elves that all things occur in cycles, life included, again reflects rebirth. So it is entirely possible that there was simply another conjunction of spheres which either reopened the portals between worlds, allowing the elves to leave, or restored magic in full force to the world, allowing the elves to open these portals to other worlds themselves, thereby completing the cycle as elves once again moved on to a new home, rebirth. Another theory involves Ciri more directly. According to Avalach, the prophecy of Ithlin means that those who follow the swallow will survive. The swallow is the symbol of spring. It is the savior, the one that opens the forbidden door to show us the way to our salvation. It will allow the rebirth of the world, the swallow, the child of the elder blood. If you followed Ciri's life in both the books and the games, you'll notice that she gets along famously with non-humans, and she sympathizes with their plight immensely, especially after seeing the ruins of Shadowed. While she was on the run from the Wild Hunt, she received help from non-human friends and those that defend the rights of non-humans. It would not at all be out of the ordinary for Ciri to find a way to help the elves leave this world for good, using her elder blood powers. Once they found their new home, perhaps they could experiment with some of those hormones Avalach mentioned that made elves pregnant so easily when sleeping with humans. So now you know the beginning and the possible end of the elves. But of course I haven't mentioned Iorveth nearly enough, so let me also tell you about a minor theory I have on how Iorveth might have escaped the executions at the Ravine of the Hydra. When Toruviel and several other elves passed by Yara's cart and the humans stopped to share their bread with the elves, it is noted that only one of the elves wore the silver lightning bolts of the Vryheid Brigade. Could this person have been Iorveth? It's never noted that he escaped the executions. We know it's not Coignach Dareo, the commando Toruviel left with before, because we know he was at the executions. We know it's not Isengrim because he was also there and he escaped. There's also no mention of his disfigured face. Could it be that Iorveth only escaped the executions because he was, in all probability, in Brokilon to heal? The elves in the Vryheid Brigade had lightning bolts on their cloaks, but it's never mentioned that they have them on their sleeves as well. In fact, in the official translation before the executions, the Nilfgaardian officer talking to the Vryheid officers specifically notes the following after the officers tear off their silver lightning bolts from their sleeves. "An irresponsible demonstration," he said. "Furthermore, in your place, I wouldn't rid myself so lightly of Imperial insignia. I feel the duty to inform you that, as Imperial officers, during the negotiations of the conditions of the peace treaty, you were guaranteed fair trials, lenient sentences, and a swift amnesty." So, the lightning bolts on their sleeves marked one as an Imperial officer, not a soldier. Emir was hardly going to march over to Brokilon to demand they give up Iorveth as a Vryheid officer. The Dryads didn't let anyone near their forests at that point. Now, you might be wondering why I didn't talk about many of the in-game events regarding elves. And that's because, well, it's really just more of the same. Scoia'tael is still fighting for freedom, although of course their leaders, Yevon and Iorveth, were interesting characters in and of themselves. They both had the same goal. While Iorveth was willing to work alongside humans now, that was only the case because he knew the elves had no chance of killing every human alive before the elves went extinct. He's compromising, though, trust me, he would still opt for killing them all if he thought it feasible. Elves, as a rule, are just as racist against humans as humans are against non-humans. Yevon, on the other hand, was a brash elf that, even though there was no chance at true victory, kept fighting as he always did. If I'm honest, I feel like CDPR left quite a few options open for elven games. For example, in Dandelion's journal, he notes the following after meeting Iorveth in Vergen on Roach's Path. However, the two finally parted ways, and that short meeting was their last, at least where this story is concerned. Implying there is another story where Iorveth meets Geralt. And of course, there is this Gwent card. The elf in the back seems like it just might be Iorveth. The bandana on the wrong eye, you say? Well, it wouldn't be the first time an image is simply flipped because the designers found it more aesthetically pleasing. And when we flip it over, it's on the correct eye. Iorveth and his elves left Vergen for unknown reasons. It can't be because they figured out Saskia was a dragon. Iorveth already knew that. And judging by this card, perhaps they went back to Dol Blathanna to defend their elven state after all. Of course, only time will tell, but rest assured I will not shut up about Iorveth until we have another game with him in it. Where he has an actual role to play, of course. And until that time, I hope you enjoyed our little trip through non-human land. Vafail.
Sooner or later, humans will kill off all the Enshe, all dwarves and gnomes. Then they'll start murdering one another. Your kind knows no other way. It's in your genes. You'll keep killing each other until only one remains, the strongest among you. 1,000 years from now, a dim-witted human barbarian will climb to the top of a pile of bones, sit down and proclaim, "I win."